Welcome back, students. We are continuing on our road to independence with cause number 18. And this cause actually is an individual, Sam Adams. We've talked about him with the Sons of Liberty and just being kind of that rebel rouser, that mouthpiece of the early revolution. He is given the nickname Father of the American Revolution. If you're the father of something, you're kind of the creator of it. So you'll hear that term a lot in American history. We'll talk about George Washington being the father of our nation. A guy named Samuel Slater, we'll talk about later in the years, the father of industry. But the father of the American Revolution is Sam Adams. Not only did he start the Sons of Liberty, he started committees of correspondence, which were small, secretive protest groups, and then circular letters, which were used to pass information from town to town and within communities about boycotts and protests. Number 19, violence spreads, rebel violence spreads. So two events here that I'd like to highlight. So most of what was most of the revolutionary actions were happening in and around Boston, but I do want you to see that the rebel violence was spreading outside of Boston. So in April 1772, outside of New Hampshire was something called the Pine Tree Riot. And basically a lumber mill owner was arrested and fined for smuggling trees. The good trees were supposed to go to England, and then the bad trees they could sell here in the colonies. And he was smuggling the good trees to other parts of the colonies and getting a higher price for them. And he was arrested and fined for that. And so an angry mob helped him attack and beat up the royal sheriff. And then June of that same year, outside of Rhode Island, is the burning of the Gaspee. The Gaspee was a British revenue ship that was chasing colonial smugglers. They ended up running into running aground is what it's called. Typically, the water gets too shallow. And they have some damage to their boat, so they ran aground. The Patriots boarded the ship, killed the ship's captain, and then stole all the gold and silver that was supposed to be going to the king, and then they set the ship on fire. So this was a really violent act when you're talking about stealing gold and silver from the king and killing the ship's captain of that British revenue patrol ship. So Pine Tree Riot and burning of the Gaspee, just a couple of events to highlight that rebel violence was spreading. Number 20 is the Tea Act. So we talked about the Townshend Acts back on number 16, I believe. And the Townshend Acts put a tax on lead, paper, paint, glass, and tea. Well, the colonists started boycotting again and leading to some serious protests and leading to British merchants losing money again, just like what had happened after the Stamp Act protests. So Parliament repeals all of the Townshend Acts except they keep the tax on tea. However, the tax decreases because now the Tea Act basically says that the British East India Company can sell its tea directly to the 13 colonies. There's still a small tax on it, but not as great a tax as what was under the Townshend Acts. So the British government assumed that the colonists would be happy with this because now they can buy directly from the British East India Company and their taxes would go down a little bit. The problem is part of the Tea Act said that the colonies could only purchase British East India Company tea. This creates what's called a monopoly. A monopoly is when you have complete control over something. So imagine if we take this example to today and we can pick a product. So let's say coffee. I know a lot of you are coffee lovers. And let's say that the only place you're allowed to buy coffee from is McDonald's. You can't buy coffee from Quick Trip. You can't buy it from Love Coffee, from Scooters, from Starbucks. You pick your favorite place. You can't go there unless McDonald's is your favorite place. That's the only place you can buy coffee from. Or you pick pizza. I'm a huge pizza guy, and I love trying pizza from all different places. But if you're telling me that I can only buy pizza from CiCi's Pizza, I'm not going to be real happy because I like Sarpino's and I like Minsky's and I like Godfather's and I like Domino's and I like Papa Murphy's. So I like different types of pizza. And so if you're telling me that I can only buy from CiCi's Pizza, I'm going to be upset. And so that was part of the problem with the Tea Act, which leads us, of course, to the famous Boston Tea Party, December 16th, 1773. Sons of Liberty, led by Sam Adams and James Otis and Paul Revere, they dressed up like Mohawk Indians, which means they put some paint on their face and put some feathers in their hair to try to disguise themselves. And there were these 3 ships that were anchored in Boston Harbor with British East India Company tea on it. And the harbor masters would not, the dock masters would not let them unload the tea. And so it just sat there. And then eventually the Sons of Liberty boarded these 3 ships. And there were 342 crates of tea on these 3 ships. And they just started tossing them into Boston Harbor. And Great Britain lost about $1 million worth of tea just on that night. And of course, the colonists cheered and thought it was, a great thing. There were some colonists, that even patriots, who thought they'd kind of stepped over the line, because now you're costing, the British government a lot of money when you're getting up in the $1 million range. So that's the Boston Tea Party. As a response to the Boston Tea Party, Parliament passes a set of laws known as the Intolerable Acts. Now, their official name was called the Coercive Acts. To coerce somebody means that you are trying to force them. So in this case, they're trying to force the colonists to pay for the damaged tea. So they basically, Boston owes $1 million. And the term Intolerable Acts, that was a nickname the colonists gave to it, because if something is intolerable, you can't stand it. And there were 5 parts to the Intolerable Acts. Let's just highlight a couple of them. So number 1, Boston Harbor is completely shut down until the colonists pay for the tea. So no longer is Boston allowed to import or export any goods. And so that was going to obviously hurt them financially. Number 2, the king suspended Massachusetts colonial charter, meaning they were no longer allowed to have their elected government meeting and making decisions for them. Basically, the entire colony of Massachusetts was put under royal control. And number 3, the area known as Canada was given control of the Ohio River Valley. Remember, the Ohio River Valley is something that the colonists had ached for and had fought for, and then the proclamation line basically said, you don't get it anymore. And they initially reserved it for the Indians. This was back in 1763. Well, fast forward 11 years, and now the British government is creating a colonial government for this area known as Canada, and they're going to give Canada control of that Ohio River Valley. So let's go back to that example that I used in class. If you were in class and I talked about you saving up for 3 years to buy a car, and then you got to drive it for a little bit, and then your parents took it away from you. That was the proclamation line. Well, now take this a step further, and let's say that your parents gave your car to your brother or your cousin or your stepsister, okay, to a close relative. Your hard-earned money in that car, and it got taken from you and given away to somebody else. That's what this part of the Intolerable Acts is. There were a couple of other minor parts of the Intolerable Acts. I'm not going to focus too much on those. You can read about those in the Crisis Deepens handout, however. Number 23, the First Continental Congress meets in Philadelphia in September of 1774. And once again, they write a letter to the king. We'll see if it works this time. We know what happened last time they wrote a letter to the king during the Stamp Act protests. And they basically told the king, told him, not asked him, they told him, repeal all of the Intolerable Acts, or all 13 colonies are going to stop all trade with Great Britain. They told the king that he was taking away their life, liberty, and property. And if he did not stop, then they were going to continue resisting at even a scale greater than what he saw during the Stamp Act or the Townshend Acts. And they also encouraged each colony to start setting up local militia and to start gathering up arms or weapons. So now the colonies are starting to arm themselves and starting to create small little town militaries. That's going to take us to Patrick Henry's speech, March 23rd, 1775. We're getting closer to the start of the war. He gives a passionate speech to the House of Burgesses, and in this he starts convincing colonists to not only think about independence, but to really start coming to grips with the fact that they're going to have to go to war for independence. And he finishes this speech with one of the more famous lines in American history, and he says, "I don't know about you, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." And those 7 words, give me liberty or give me death, echoed throughout the colonies. They were printed in newspapers. The term liberty or death became kind of a tagline throughout the colonies. So we had join or die. We've got no taxation without representation, and now we have give me liberty or give me death. And this really fueled the fire across the colonies. And that takes us to number 25. The shot heard round the world. April 19th, 1775, 900 British troops are arriving in Lexington, Massachusetts. It's just a small town outside of Boston. They were going to arrest Sam Adams and John Hancock for being rebel leaders and being traitors to the British crown. And so Paul Revere and two other midnight riders took off that night, riding on horseback, going from town to town, warning that the redcoats were coming, the British were coming, warning Sam Adams and John Hancock they needed to get into hiding. Then they also went on to the nearby town of Concord to warn those soldiers that the British were coming to seize their colonial arms and ammunition. And outside of Lexington that morning, somebody fired a shot as the colonists and the redcoats were faced off against each other across a field. We still to this day do not know who fired that first shot. Could have been a hunter out in the woods. Nobody really knows who it was. Once that shot was fired, though, both sides started firing at each other, and war had officially begun in Lexington. The battle continued on to the nearby town of Concord, and so they lumped Lexington and Concord together as the opening fights, opening shots of the American Revolution. Lexington and Concord would be like fighting in Lee Summit and then fighting in Greenwood, or fighting in Greenwood and fighting down in Pleasant Hill or something like that. So just a few miles away that separated those two towns. So that's the shot heard around the world. We still to this day do not know who fired it, whether it was British, whether it was colonists, whether it was some hunter in the woods, but fighting began. And that leads to number 26, the Second Continental Congress. They meet in Philadelphia again. This is the second time they've met. And this time they choose president of the Congress. They're going to pick John Hancock to kind of be their government leader. Okay, he's not the president yet. We don't have a United States yet. He's just kind of the leader of this committee, this Continental Congress. They pick George Washington, who has the most battle experience from his time in the French and Indian War, and he's going to be their commander-in-chief of this newly formed Continental Army. This Continental Army is going to fight all over the 13 colonies, all over the continent, and he is going to be their leader. The colonies are not going to fight individually. They are going to fight together. And Washington asked for 20,000 volunteers to serve for up to 1 year. And each colony starts writing its own individual new constitution, expecting that independence is probably on the way. And George Washington also agreed to serve as commander-in-chief for zero pay. He was not going to get paid at all. He was a wealthy plantation owner. Had kind of been retired back in Mount Vernon, and he decided to come out of retirement to lead this army. And this is where we will end our road to independence. We're not quite there yet. You'll notice we're only on number 26, 27, 28, 29, and 30. We're actually going to get in the next beginning of the next chapter when we will talk about the Declaration of Independence. So this kind of ends our information for chapter 5 and the road to revolution, because we have officially begun the war with those shots fired at Lexington and Concord, and then the formation of this Continental Army. Have a great day.